Hello everyone, and on behalf of ANROWS, I welcome you to today's webinar, No More Circles, Learning from Survivors, Perpetrators and Practitioners on How to Respond Better to Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence. I'm Michelle Robinson, the Director of Evidence to Action at ANROWS, and as we begin, I acknowledge the country on which we meet today. I'm coming to you from the lands of the Gadigal peoples of the Eora Nation. On behalf of ANROWS and the panel, I pay respect to elders past and present. Wherever we are today, we are on unceded Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander land, and I acknowledge and pay respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating in this session. In today's webinar, we'll hear a presentation on the research, followed by a panel discussion and live Q&A. As you can send your questions through at any time during the discussion by clicking the question icon on GoToWebinar dashboard, which is on the right-hand side of your screen. We will try to answer as many as we can get through. 2 research reports launched today are available in the handout section of the GoToWebinar platform. And if you'd like to access closed captions, please click on the link provided in the chat box. The webinar will be recorded and it will be available on the ANROWS website as soon as possible. Or you can subscribe to Notepad, our e-newsletter, to be notified around when it's available. Finally, we'll have a survey that will pop up as you exit. If you could complete it, we'd be very appreciative of your feedback. This is a confronting topic, and some participants may find it distressing. It's important to take care of yourself while watching this webinar. If you would like to access support, please contact 1800-RESPECT on 1800-737-732 or Lifeline on 131114. As part of the 16 Days of Activism campaign, ANROWS is overjoyed and very happy to be launching findings from this research project, Transforming Responses to Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence, Listening to the Voices of Victims, Perpetrators and Services. It's a national study in 2 parts, which explores the help-seeking journeys of victims and survivors and those who use violence, with insights from the service sector on how to improve system responses to intimate partner and sexual violence. The first report, Voices from the Frontline, examines the experiences of those working in the domestic and family violence service sector, with recommendations on how to improve system responses to intimate partner violence and sexual violence. The second report, I just felt like I was running around in a circle, listening to the voices of victims and perpetrators to transform responses to intimate partner violence, maps the abuse and violence experiences of women in Australia, highlighting patterns and types of violence and impacts on health. The data from national surveys and in-depth interviews draws a very clear picture of their experiences of help seeking and support needs. While previous studies have focused on help seeking in discrete contexts, for example, emergency departments, primary healthcare providers and the court system, this study is an innovation in that it provides a broader view of the help seeking journey and identifies key areas where barriers to service delivery could be addressed. The study is also the first in Australia to explore how people who use intimate partner violence and sexual violence seek help, their support needs, and key areas where services could be strengthened so that they can respond in a way that represents an appropriate balance of accountability with empathy. This research produces several very important recommendations for policy and practice, some of which we will unpack today. So on to the panel. I'd like to introduce you to today's presenters. Professor Kelsey Hegarty, University of Melbourne and the Royal Women's Hospital. Dr. Patricia Cullen, Faculty of Melbourne from the University of New South Wales. Steve Walton, who is the Manager, Men's Domestic and Family Violence Interventions, New South Wales Health Education Centre Against Violence, otherwise known as ECAV. Lily Fetter, an advocate with Weaver's panel, and that acronym stands for Women and Their Children Who Have Experienced Abuse and Violence, Researchers and Advisors, and Midwife. And Laura Brooks, who is a Senior Counsellor and Mental Health Team Leader at the Illawarra Women's Health Centre. Welcome, everybody. These are big reports filled with lots of valuable data and insights. So we'll ask the lead authors to present an overview of their findings initially. So Trish will start us off with sharing her findings from the first report, Voices from the Frontline, and then Kelsey will share a presentation on the second report, Listening to the Voices of Victims and Perpetrators to Transform Responses to Intimate Partner Violence, and then we'll open up the discussion with the panel. So over to you, Trish.
Thanks so much, Michelle. Rachel, could we just go to the next slide now, please? Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the custodians of the land that we're all on. I'm on beautiful Dharawal country, and I pay respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining today. Next slide, please, Rachel. I want to recognise the lived and living experience of everyone here today, as well as everyone who has contributed to this research. We're very, very grateful to the Voices Advisory Committee for their oversight, but especially to the workforce who responded to this survey, who generously shared their knowledge and their expertise. The dataset that I'm presenting on today is richly detailed, and it gives unique perspectives from a very experienced workforce. And it brings about really important insights into the strengths and the challenges of working in this complex sector. I'd also like to acknowledge my report co-authors who are listed here. Next slide, please. This is quite a unique study, and it's certainly very difficult to typical survey research. The design was a qualitative online survey which aimed to provide insight into the workforce's perspectives on the effectiveness, the appropriateness, as well as the enablers and the barriers to a range of interventions and responses. And we really wanted to explore what change the workforce believe is required for preventing and responding to domestic, family and sexual violence in Australia. As I said, we had oversight from an advisory committee that included representatives from government, frontline services, advocacy groups and people with lived experience. And they really helped to shape the design of the survey, the recruitment process, the analysis and the reporting. Our survey contained two sections. Firstly, people were asked to briefly provide their demographics and career information. And then in the second section, they were asked to nominate specific groups of people they felt able to comment on. So the options included young people, older people, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, culturally and linguistically diverse communities, people with a disability or disabled people, LGBTQ+ communities, women who are or have been incarcerated, sex workers, and people living in rural or remote areas. And they were asked to identify up to 3 existing responses or interventions that were promising or effective, and up to 3 that were ineffective for each group that they nominated. So those who responded wrote detailed, long-form answers about what they consider is working well, what's not working, and where the gaps are. They identified responses that are promising, but really require more investment or resourcing to be really effective. So unlike a fully qualitative approach, the survey contained fixed questions. And so there are some drawbacks in that it doesn't allow for conversation or following up for more details. But we felt that the anonymity of this online format really enabled people to be candid and considered in their responses. And there's certainly a richness and diversity of experience within the data. Could I have the next slide, please? So we had 95 people who were included in the analysis, and 91% of the sample identified as female. Geographically, the majority of people were drawn from Victoria, WA, and New South Wales. Next slide, please. The majority of the participants were practitioners, and 2/3 had more than 6 years experience, with most of these having 10 or more years experience, so a very experienced group of practitioners. Next slide, please. When we looked at the specific sector that practitioners and managers worked in, there was a good spread. However, there are some limitations in our sample. For example, we had no participants from child protection, from housing, or from LGBTQ+ specialist services. Next slide, please. We generated 5 key themes that you can see here that reflected the workforce perceptions about what is needed to better support victims and survivors, children and young people, and people who use violence. And I'll briefly describe each of these. So next slide. This first theme here really speaks to the need for greater investment in addressing upstream determinants and intersecting forms of inequality, which are root causes of violence in our relationships, in our families, schools, workplaces, and our communities. And the workforce identified key social determinants that require an upstream approach, with the primary ones being poverty, safe and affordable housing, and equal participation in the workforce. Next slide. This second theme points to the reactivity and inequity in responses and the need for systemic changes that will address traumatisation, re-traumatisation, and ineffective responses that ultimately harm victims and survivors. So rather than viewing people in terms of discrete identities, respondents took an intersectional approach, and they described the often less visible ways that reactivity and inequities and service gaps can harm victims and survivors. So for example, they emphasise that there's less resourcing for prevention, early intervention and recovery. And the system is set up to be reactive to incidents of violence. And this reactivity unjustly and disproportionately impacts Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and communities. Similarly, with regard to perpetrators, the workforce identified shortcomings in responses that are typically focused on averting immediate risk. They felt there was a lack of long-term supports for people who use violence, with insufficient trauma-informed services and a lack of housing. And this, I guess, ultimately means that there's not enough being done to generate lasting change, and this ultimately contributes to recidivism that we see, and it increases the risk for victims and survivors. Next slide, please. This theme draws on the views that we need cultural shifts in our understanding of domestic, family and sexual violence, so that we consider how violence intersects with the broader context of social determinants. And so people describe the ways that victim blaming results in responses and outcomes that do not adequately hold perpetrators to account, and they also further traumatise victims and survivors. And so these issues were particularly described with regard to the legal system and in the context of child protection frameworks and debates around coercive control. So the workforce indicated support for the social entrapment model, which avoids victim blaming and has potential to promote holistic responses. And within this, they also indicated that child-focused models such as Safe and Together are promising. Next slide. This theme draws on inequities that constrain choice and resourcefulness of victims and survivors. So in practice, what this means is that systems that are intended to enable safety and agency can instead entrench victims and survivors' isolation, their mistrust and their sense of loss. So the respondents emphasised that choice and self-determination are critical, but particularly for victims and survivors for whom mainstream services may not adequately meet their needs for cultural safety, for inclusion and accessibility. And resourcing was the big issue that people kept kind of attributing this to. We know that that impacts the availability of services and choice, particularly in rural areas. But they also pointed to widespread inconsistencies in access to information about rights and options, which really reflects the need for broader systemic shifts towards trauma and violence-informed responses that will promote choice and dignity and agency. Next slide, please. Recovery was a big focus, and fundamental to this are our shared experiences that bring opportunities for connection and for compassion. We know that building therapeutic relationships is key to healing, and the workforce really pointed to innovative and promising solutions that will better support the healing and recovery of victims and survivors and children and young people, but also for people who use violence, and this was identified as a key component of violence prevention. Next slide, please. Overall, our report and our findings outline some important opportunities and priorities for service system improvement, with recommendations across the 4 key areas outlined here, which you can read about more in the report. But very briefly, the workforce called for violence to be addressed within the context of other social determinants, such as safe housing, income equality, workforce participation, social inclusion, and equitable access to justice, health, and social services. We have recommendations that address the inadequate funding models and support the implementation of strengths-based approaches that are trauma-informed and decolonising across health, justice and social services. But we know that this requires enabling policy and substantial investment in strengthening workforce capability and collaboration. But really, there's also a need for greater investment in child-specific interventions and bringing forth innovative responses. And as I said, promoting healing recovery was viewed as a priority, not just for further research, but also for service development. So as I hand over to Kelsey now, I just want to say thank you to ANROWS for asking me to do this project. It's been an absolute honour to do it. It's very evident that the workforce's immense knowledge of the complexities and the strengths and the challenges faced by the sector are so valuable to driving change, and it really demonstrates the value of embedding lived experience in policy and practice solutions. I'll hand over to you now, Kelsey.
Thanks very much, Trish. And yeah, if you can get my slides up, that'd be great. And we did this separately, and it is fascinating, as I hope you'll find, that in fact, it's mirrored from the service providers as to what survivors and people who use partner violence and sexual violence wanted. So thanks very much for this first slide. So I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I'm on Wurundjeri land and that this land's never been ceded. And I'd like to also acknowledge all the survivors who are here today for their strength and resilience in the face of trauma, and I hope these findings resonate with your experiences. This project arose out of a lack of hearing from survivors and what they need from services. And we know even less about what would engage people who use partner violence and sexual violence to seek help. And note, this project concentrated on survivors who identify as women and those of any gender who use partner violence and/or sexual violence against women. So we undertook online surveys with just over 1,000 women survivors, and they had to screen positive for being afraid or controlled or physically hurt by a partner or ex-partner, or have experienced unwanted sex by anyone in the last 5 years. And we engaged with 500 people, just over 500 people who used partner violence and sexual violence, who screened positive for being concerned about their behaviour. So they may have also believed they'd scared a partner or ex-partner who had sought help to address issues. And both of these were in the last 5 years, because we're really wanting to try and look at the current system, not historically. But we also wanted to do a mixed methods where we could take a deep dive with interviews with a selection of participants from the surveys to get this really good picture. Next slide, please. So throughout this presentation, the women are presented in orange and the people who use violence in brown. So almost all of the quantitative was led by, quantitative analysis was led by Elizabeth McClendon. And the first thing is, so who did we get in this survey? This shows that we obtained, a sample that was generally representative and diverse. But if we look at the figures for not born in Australia and English as a second language, we can see that they're below the national average, but of course the survey was in English. If we look at those identifying as not heterosexual and Aboriginal and/or Torres Strait Islander, we actually got more Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander than the national average. So next slide, please. Victim survivors had a very heavy trauma load across their lifetime, with 70% having had child abuse. And what I want you to look at now in the 3 circles is the figures in purple. So most women had experienced, like half of them had experienced both or 3, physical violence, sexual violence and psychological violence. 1 in 5 had physical violence or psychological violence, and 1 in 10 had psychological violence and sexual violence. So you can see that that combined form of abuse, which is what we see as coercive control, we can see that that has also made them very afraid. If you look at the figures on the right, about being currently afraid through to ever afraid, and it's the vast majority of our sample. And just to note that 33% of them had experienced reproductive coercion as well. So a large trauma load. Now, not shown on the screen is that half of the perpetrator participants had experienced child abuse, and these people were more likely to use violence against a partner in adulthood. And if you remember, the screening questions were such that they could come in if they had sought help for an intimate relationship. And we asked them about 15 specific abusive behaviours on the composite abuse scale, short form, and 60% of our sample had done those 15 specific behaviours. But you can read the details in the report. Next slide, please. So let's now look at health associations, which were present for survivors to a greater extent, more than perpetrators, for all issues as you look across. And post-traumatic stress disorder was the highest health issue, followed by anxiety and then depression. And I think it's interesting to note that reasonable numbers of both the victim survivors and the perpetrators have actually identified as having a chronic illness or a disability and having poor or fair health. I know I'm going through this quickly because I want to get to the recommendations, but I'm hoping you're following what I'm saying. So the next slide, we're turning to help seeking. So as you can see, as with other research, the family and friends are who victims and survivors, but also perpetrators, turn to seek some help, followed by health services, and in fact, then specialist services. And if you look at the figure for the perpetrators around seeking specialist services, including the hotline, it was only 11% of this sample. And then the formal services of police and legal were less again. So next slide, please. So if we look at the helpfulness, I found this really interesting. So remember, not everybody sought help, but of those who did, we asked them how helpful they found it. And look, it's pretty high, isn't it? Except for the police, you know, but even that's half. So in fact, people are getting something out of seeking help. So across the board, the levels were around 2/3. So next slide, please. Now let's move into the barriers to help seeking. So it's, I think, a sad indictment still that shame is the highest for both the victim survivors and for the perpetrators. And for survivors, you know, it's hard to believe for us in the system that a lack of awareness about services that could help was present for 2/3 of them. And still concerns about confidentiality, that someone would break confidentiality, were major barriers for half the women there. So if we turn to the people who use partner violence and sexual violence, you can see that belief that violence is a normal part of a relationship and access challenges were the highest. And of note, not shown on the slide, is that perpetrators held attitudes that support violence against women at higher levels than the Community Attitude Survey Australian population figures. An example would be that 57% of this group of people who answered, who were perpetrators, agreed that men should take control in relationships and be the head of the household, compared to 16% of the general population. So that's certainly something linking the attitudes with the use of violence and abuse. Okay, so the next slide, let's move on to the, you know, sometimes what I find more interesting, even though I'm a quantitative researcher, is the qualitative data, which Mandy McKenzie and Laura Tarzia analysed. Mandy interviewed 30 women and showed that while there were examples of good responses that were pivotal in helping people get supported and safe, the central theme across all stages of help seeking was that women felt they were left to carry the burden of fixing the problem alone. And you can see that we've got 5 phases. Now, these phases of help seeking, they don't go linearly across the page. We've just had to put them on there to show you. And not everybody went through each of these phases, but and sometimes they go back and forth. But the phases included maintaining hope, assessing options, getting out for some of them, establishing independence and safety, and then addressing impact and making sense. And they did seek help from different people in these different phases. And I'm not going to read the quotes out. I hope you've had a little bit of time to have a look at them while I've been talking. But in fact, a lot of these services, all of them did not meet the needs of the women, and they felt that they were still carrying the burden alone. They felt that they were responsible for managing the perpetrator's behaviour, protecting themselves, and dealing with the impacts and their impacts on their children. And the support offered was primarily short-term. The focus was on physical violence and the immediate risks of harm and separating from the perpetrator. Women were offered few material or financial resources to help them re-establish their independence or to sort out their post-separation legal arrangements. We know family court's very difficult, and no follow-up or support to manage their partner's abuse or its impacts in the long term. Next slide. So part of it is thinking about, you know, and again, it's not a linear road. Imagine it winding back and forth more, but there's roadblocks and missed opportunities at each of these phases of the journey, and each contributed to this feeling of being alone. And if we go to the next one, there were also examples, next slide, thanks. There were also examples of responses from service providers that were positive or pivotal in meeting their support needs, which is great. And you know, some of them were early on in the maintaining hope about inquiring and identifying it, or in assessing options and seeking solutions, about listening and validating and exploring options. And the getting out was around income and a secure place to stay. And the re-establishing independence was around some examples of help navigating the system or helping to recognise and stop the abuse. And then the addressing impacts, particularly connecting with other survivors, was key examples of a good journey. So let's move on to the next slide, where we're turning to the interviews with 8 people who had used partner violence and sexual violence, and they were interviewed by Matt Addison, who and really this is of a group who acknowledged that they had used abuse or violence towards a partner, and the number reflects how we actually have trouble engaging or recruiting perpetrators, and we can talk about that more in the panel, but that was an issue. And by analysing the interview participants, how they described their journeys towards help seeking and change, Mandy and Laura identified 3 stages here, where bottling things up, participants suggested a build-up of stress or poor mental health or conflict and in their lives. The breaking down and letting things out was around engagement with services only occurred when they reached a crisis point, and the crisis was either a mental health breakdown or the partner leaving them with their children, and then regaining and maintaining emotional stability. Once they'd recognised their problems and found the right help, they found that sort of stabilising for them. Okay, so in next slide, just remembering that that's a small sample, so there needs to be more research in these limitations. So in summary, this has been a quick snapshot of the finding, but there's a wealth of information in the report. And the recommendations, we had 3 principles around recognising children, because children's voices were missing and mainly spoken about the survivors. The responding to diversity, because obviously this wasn't a completely diverse sample and of people experiencing structural inequalities. And the issues around promoting change within a framework of perpetrators that balances empathy with accountability. I think that needs a principle that needs more exploration. But as you can see, it's different levels that we've made recommendations, from the community level through to ongoing response. And really we need more universal education on healthy and what's healthy a relationship and what's an abusive one. Enhance public messaging about what's available to people, and also people who were financially distressed, you know, that couldn't manage on their financial income. It was a big feature throughout, so financial interventions are something we haven't explored enough. If we look at the social network, the family and friends were really important, and we're going to talk about allies training on the panel. We're also going to talk about engaging men training. But the healthy relationship first aid is like mental health first aid in workplaces and other areas, in the idea that everybody should be able to know how to respond if someone discloses in say, a workplace or a faith-based organisation. The early engagement is obviously competency and cultural training on, for health services, because we saw they were key, and both for victim survivors and for people who use partner violence and sexual violence. The system access, you know, telehealth and other things are often being pulled back now post-COVID, and yet that was something that was really valued to access. The idea of someone to help them navigate for pathways, care navigators for pathways to accessible and affordable long-term support, and accessible messaging about limits of confidentiality before they went to a service. And then finally, in the ongoing response, one of the things was around healing centres, particularly building on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander such healing centres for all members of the family. And we'll be talking about the healing centres, the trauma and violence informed care ones, but particularly peer victim and survivor led support groups, and for the health services to fund some of this through Medicare benefits. So the next slide. Finally, I want to acknowledge the whole team who contributed, the participants, the advisory committee and ANROWS for a great collaboration that will hopefully make a difference to the lives of women in this country. So I know I've gone quickly, but I hope I've given you a little snapshot so you read the 150-page report. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Kelsey. And I'm going to welcome the panel. If everyone can turn on their cameras. Welcome, everyone. Incredible, Trish and Kelsey, that the reports were done separately because they speak to us, you know, seamlessly and so directly. So welcome to the rest of the panel. We're going, I think we'll start looking at the help-seeking journey in particular and picking up on some of the points that Trish made. So you pointed out that the research found that victims and survivors reported that the service system prioritised responding to physical harm and danger, that incident-based violence. Similarly, the workforce reported that the system was reactive to incidents of violence and less resourced for early intervention and prevention. Laura, I'm going to bring you in here. You're a senior counsellor and team leader at the Illawarra Women's Health Centre. What's your experience of resourcing across different areas of response, for example, crisis intervention, medium, long-term recovery and support? Where is the focus of your resourcing and how would you like to see it change?
Well, thank you, Michelle. Our focus is on the full spectrum. We offer a range of programs, early intervention included, including our Young Women's program, which delivers therapeutic and educational group work programs within schools on a range of topics, including consent and healthy relationships. We also have our Mothers and Sons program, which offers early intervention to mums and sons, the sons aged between 6 and 8, in the hope that we're talking to boys about respect, empathy, healthy relationships to prevent violence later on. In my experience, programs that target early intervention are often not funded. We're very lucky that our Young Women's program is funded ongoing, but our Mothers and Sons program is run on top of our existing workload. So these programs often are born out of the passion of frontline workers, innovation, and their knowledge of existing gaps. So we literally run these programs often on the smell of an oily rag, so to speak, and funding is often either short term or it's a constant battle where we're trying to find ongoing funding. In terms of our medium long-term support, our mental health team consists of a small team of counsellors and caseworkers, and this is where we provide that medium to long-term recovery in the form of wraparound service provision. We do a lot on very little and we're extremely responsive to clients' needs. Our service is often the end of the road for a lot of women. They've been to every other service, they've timed out from other services, or they're not meeting the criteria of other services for whatever reason, due to their age, or they might not have children with them. So we're not time limited in our response. So our counselling, you don't need a mental health plan, self-referral, you don't need a GP referral, but it does mean that demand is high, and which means our current wait list is sitting at 70 women who are waiting to receive support. So by partnering with other agencies and having a strong volunteer workforce, we're also able to offer a range of group work programs, including peer-led sexual assault survivor groups and DV therapeutic group work programs, and other softer entry points for women that might not be ready to engage in more intensive support. So groups like yoga, craft, art therapy, those sorts of things. And then obviously we get to our crisis intervention, where we have a lot of crisis walk-ins at our centre. We're a health centre, we're not DV specific, but we recognise that we are a safe place for women in the community. So women will present most days at our centre where they are unable to return home, and we assess them as high risk. And this, in terms of resourcing, this often means that somebody has to drop everything and prioritise that immediate crisis need, which then sometimes takes us away from supporting women in that medium to long-term recovery area.
Thanks, Laura. That's yeah, it's an indictment, really, isn't it, in terms of that the holistic and the spectrum of funding and support for the across the sectors in terms of early intervention, prevention, early intervention, and response in crisis. Kelsey, you raised a really interesting point earlier, shame being one of the biggest barriers to both victims and survivors accessing support and on their help-seeking journey, and people who use intimate partner violence and sexual violence. How is shame addressed? How is this addressed in terms of service supports?
Yeah, I think it's a tricky one, because of course the person using abuse and violence will be blaming the victim for what's happening, and so as part of it, their self-esteem, their whole identity will be impacted, and so therefore they feel ashamed. It's a very deep feeling, and then men probably have shame for a different reason, because we are trying to change the norms around it and saying that this is not acceptable behaviour. So I think the better messaging about, you might feel ashamed about either experiencing it, that there's something wrong with you, or because you're using abuse and violence. So better messaging about shame as part of that community messaging. I don't think we're doing that at the moment, and it was really a feeling of shame and that it's too personal. So it's stopping it being that inside hidden horrible thing for both of the sets of populations, and I think, like, I'm not an expert in community messaging, but I think that could be done better. Yeah,
so through community messaging and through workforce development, if we look at it along the spectrum.
Oh yeah. Yeah, and services talking about shame, but this was a barrier to even going, because we know that 1 in 5 women didn't go anywhere, and 1 in 3 men didn't go anywhere. So this is really a problem.
Yeah, it looks like a really big it's a signpost in terms of where we could actually develop further policy and practice. And going back to the workforce that you talked about, Trish, one of the strengths of the domestic and family workforce that was identified was the ability for practitioners to build meaningful relationships with victims and survivors, where some of these conversations could be had. Lily, as an advocate and a midwife, how important is it to build meaningful relationships, and what are some of the barriers or opportunities to foster relationships with victims and survivors in a health setting? Given that that's where, after family and friends, the majority of victims and survivors present. And what are some of the implications of these barriers?
So building meaningful relationships is just absolutely vital. We are often the first people that victims of violence and perpetrators at times will reach out to. They won't reach out if they don't feel safe to do so. So building meaningful relationships is absolutely vital. Some of the barriers from a practitioner's setting, I think one of the biggest is time restraints, problems with referrals. Making the referral for someone is often the easy part, but the delays with appointment availability causes significant problems. having a victim present before you, or someone you detect may be experiencing violence, it can be difficult to manage that process when the perpetrator has attended the appointment with them. A lack of training or preparedness on the part of the practitioner, also a barrier. But I think one of the most significant barriers that we still face is that there are still quite a large group of practitioners who fail to recognise that working with and managing survivors and perpetrators is their responsibility. It's very, very easy to say, oh no, that's someone else's job. And I certainly know if you asked me back when I was training to be a midwife what my role was with managing family violence survivors or perpetrators, I would have been like, what? No, I deliver babies. That's not my job. It certainly has been my lived experience of navigating violence that burst that bubble for me, having to navigate my way out of an abusive relationship and then have to navigate fragmented service systems was isolating, exhausting, and time consuming. So really it was my own experience that raised my awareness of how important my role is in this space. Any role that involves working with people involves working with families. And when you're working with families, a percentage of your clients will be experiencing or using violence. So it's everyone's responsibility, both personally and professionally. As professionals, we are just in an ideal position because clients come to us or they are referred to us, and we have that opportunity to build that rapport and look out for those flags that might indicate that they are either experiencing or using violence.
Yeah, thanks, Lily. Thank you for sharing both that professional and personal experience and pointing out to us, I think, you know, the responsibility on behalf of that service providers have, which isn't always immediately obvious in, you know, when you train in a particular area, and it's what the report is speaking to. Laura, just as a practitioner, did you want to add anything to?
I just think, like Lily really hit the nail on the head around responsibility, and because it's moving away from that siloed approach where, you know, we send women here, there and everywhere. You go here for your mental health, you go here for your drug and alcohol, go here for your financial hardship, without actually going, well, hang on, what's underpinning all of these issues? So if we can all take responsibility, and we can all take responsibility for our own skills in terms of being DV informed, we reduce those barriers for women.
And taking that responsibility does have, I guess, an impact for the organisation in terms of authorising environment and support and development for enabling practitioners to actually respond, and in a broader sense than their immediate sort of position description work, which Kelsey has done in the WID study earlier. Bringing you in now, Steve. This is Australia's first study exploring help-seeking journeys for people who use violence. And in particular, we're talking about intimate partner violence and or sexual violence. The research found that people who use violence also want to be heard and listened to. As manager of men's domestic and family violence intervention in New South Wales ECAV, which I'll get you to explain what that means, how important is it for the sector to understand or learn about the experiences of people who use violence to support them in their journey of behaviour change?
Yeah, thank you, Michelle. Before I start, I want to acknowledge I'm on Bannermata land here. People pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land that's never been ceded, and of course to our elders past, present and emerging. The Education Centre Against Violence, I'm a manager on the Men's Domestic Family Violence Interventions portfolio. We've been around for about 35 years. We deliver training throughout the state on violence, abuse and neglect. And our particular portfolio was established around about 2016 in delivering training in the sector in New South Wales on engaging men who use violence against their intimate partners. And we have core courses, and we have our graduate certificate. But apart from that, three distinct points I want to make. First of all is if we're to learn and to engage men, three key points I want to make is dignity and respect, responding to complexity and responding to risk. Everyone should be treated with dignity and respect, and this can be difficult to hold because violence-informed work is trauma-informed work, isn't it? And I think the tension that we risk for ourselves at times, particularly ethically, is, am I letting down mum of the kids if I truly listen to him? Am I siding with him if I give him too much space? Luke Adamsall, one of New South Wales' most experienced men's behaviour change practitioners, says that one of the most respectful things I can do for a man is hold him to and support him to be accountable. And one of the most accountable things I can do as a professional, I think he says, is be respectful to him. So accountability isn't separate entity to compassion. They're parts of a whole, providing that experience. A man who uses control to begin to experience being held to account, experience being held in all his complexity. So accountability and compassion are together. And you might remember, I think it was 2019, ANROWS, Engaging Men Who Use Violence, invitational narrative approaches looked at curious respect and inquiry that addresses shame, supporting men to explore their ethical preferences, creating that environment that's really non-judgmental, and really dig into shame. And I think it was the 2020 Exploring the Client-Worker Relationships made reference to the importance of digging in. So this idea that working with men is really complex for so many reasons. It's about holding mum and the kids in view, thinking about the bigger arena of hearing the voices of women and children. How will they want and need me to respond here as I listen to him? And as I'm listening to him, I'm really being curious about how he's managing himself. The other is around complexity, thinking about, we know that coercive control and abuse is so connected to complex trauma, and the report is amazing and speaks to that on so many different levels. Your previous reports around refugee backgrounds speaks to that, makes clear reference to the work of men's behaviour change being one of understanding diversity, meeting intersections with curiosity and respect, holding that comorbid lens. And when we're thinking about we're engaging men, we're listening to not just the causal factors, and that was a really interesting point, around 50% of the men speak around their attitudes, but we're also listening to the wider lens, biological influences, drug and alcohol, PTSD. We're listening to the man's experiences. So in this complexity, we're really wanting to hear how these intersections impact his life, and in particular those he harms. And so here we're kind of listening for safe choices. And finally, just thinking about identifying and responding to risk. Sarah May, she's one of the practitioners in New South Wales, says a respectful engagement might reveal, and certainly does reveal, risk information, and that men who use violence provide a narrative that it tends to be a one-off incident. So that idea of contracting with the man in moments of dialogue around his intent, around being curious about his language, around his motives, his ideals, can really inform us about his risk to mum and the kids. And being open about our intent to explore his world, to explore his risk. This all fits with lifting trust. So for example, you'd be asking questions around, tell me more about that, help me understand this argument, how did you respond to this? So men may be actually, and it's probably no surprise in the report which says men want to be heard. Men want to be heard to kind of speak to those experiences, but it's a really great opportunity to dig into some of those triggers. So yeah, so from here, you know, if we're looking at digging into that pattern of cycling around his responsibility taking, it can tell us a lot about how he manages himself and the choices that he makes, and in particular, empathy for his partner and kids. So there's three key points there I wanted to make, particularly around dignity and respect, listening to him, responding to the complexity of the work, and in particular identifying and responding to risk.
Yeah. And which what key point or key principle from the report spoke loudest to you in terms of responding or to the help seeking of men who use violence?
Yeah, probably the one that stood out for me most is that they speak to their family and friends, which we'll yarn about in a moment, and that it speaks to everyone needs training around responding to men who use violence, and being able to listen to risk, being able to listen to work out what's going on for him now, how can I refer him to a service. So for me, what was interesting is how men who use violence are open with, particularly with their family and friends and their GPs first.
Lovely segue. Thanks, Steve. And just, to recap on that point that Kelsey made earlier, the research tells us that the role of family and friends is critical in help-seeking behaviours of both victims and survivors, with 64% of the sample reporting that they spoke about their abuse to family or friends, and 2/3 of them found it helpful. And for people who use violence, it was 59% spoke to their family and friends, and 74% of that sample found their responses were helpful. So it's a really critical component in help seeking. So let's unpack that and have a look at, sorry, Steve, did you want to say something?
No, it's completely great.
Yeah. So what do we do about this? And we're going to now go into some of the recommendations that the reports have identified in terms of responding to these findings. So one of the recommendations, and you raised this earlier, Kelsey, was allies training for family and friends who are, as we know, often the first people that victims and survivors go to for help. Lily, I'm going to ask you, what would you like to see included in allies training? If you think about it and just unpack it a bit for us, and perhaps building on the explanation that Kelsey gave earlier.
Yeah, so I'd love to see myth busting training given. So around the common things like, why didn't you just leave? Helping them understand that once separation happens, it's actually the most risky time, and often the abuse doesn't end there. So preparing family and friends about how things are likely to escalate post-separation and how they might be used by the perpetrator as a proxy abuser, and giving them tools to respond to the perpetrator. Education on victim blaming and comments to avoid that are harmful, like it takes two to tango, or what did you do to provoke him? Training on how to support victims, whether that be through their safety planning phases or later on supporting them through courts processes. Explaining to them the impact on a victim of a passive bystander. So that is often doing or saying nothing sends a clear message to the perpetrator that their behaviour is acceptable, and it sends a clear message to the victim that you're not going to support them. So things like that would be really helpful.
Yeah. Thanks, Lily. And just Kelsey, just unpacking what you mean by allies.
Yeah, because I mean, obviously people use bystander a lot. Yeah, sorry, I was just checking I wasn't on mute. And I think key to me, in addition to absolutely what Lily said, is a model called care, and it's how you would go about, interacting with someone when they disclose to you. And the care, and Laura Tarzia and a number of us developed this model. It's giving the survivor choice and control, that's the C. It's helping with action and advocacy, so practical things, minding their children while they go to court, things like that. It's actually recognising and understanding all the things that you were just talking about, Lily, and then emotional connection. So anybody can do that. Absolutely anybody can stick to those principles, and with a bit of training. And even if you don't know everything about domestic violence, or you don't know everything about what's happening, you don't need to know. But if you treat people that way as an ally, and, as well as that, you're listening and inquiring about needs and trying to validate what they're experiencing, then you are really on a pathway to being their ally.
And I imagine it'd be such an educative tool more broadly in terms of, his own experiences of violence as well. So that's sort of a trauma-informed lens.
And there's a few examples in Women's Aid in Wales are doing a broad community-based program called Ask Me training. So there are models that we can look at. They're talked about in the report.
and allied training for perpetrators or people who use violence, I should say. Steve, is that anything that you've engaged with or utilised or have models? As Kelsey just pointed out, there's one in the UK.
Yes, certainly. It's an emerging need. We don't have direct experience in that work, in bystander work and ally work and training, but it's certainly emerging interest, and particularly from wider workforces and moving right out into communities. So we do have conversations with the community around responding to men who, or if it's been disclosed to them that they're using violence. Yeah.
And this leads into the next question. People who use violence also went to friends and family for help, as we know. The research has recommended engaging men training for family and friends to effectively respond to people who use intimate partner violence and or sexual violence. So Steve, I guess again, this comes back to some of what you've been discussing. Engaging men training, what does that look like? And then we might open up to you, Trish and Kelsey.
Yeah, so briefly, look, it makes particular sense if we're thinking about that men hold these attitudes around what it means to be a man, all these attitudes around fear of shame, men don't cry, men shouldn't share their feelings, so on and so forth. So it can be really difficult to engage men, but I think family and friends should learn really what does it mean to begin to listen deeply. It was interesting, the report indicated that men wanted to have these deeper yarns, and I think family and friends need to look at skilling up, learning some basics around motivational interviewing, and being able to hear and hold some of those complex stories. Heath Allison, one of New South Wales key industry experts, he uses this term, giving men generous space to explore themselves, this idea that perhaps family and friends, instead of kind of shutting down and isolating him even more, and we know that marginalised men experience that even more than white fellas, thinking about that it's so critical for people to learn those skills, to be able to hear and to be able to respond to his denying, minimising and blaming, and perhaps the way forward is for us is to coach them to really dig in and to listen with some depth to the man, and then perhaps be knowledgeable about referrals or how they can continue to keep him accountable and open those conversations up. That would be my recommendation.
And is there anything in place, or is anything around engaging men happening in your space?
Not with family and friends at present. No, it's currently our portfolio delivers training to the workforce on initiating those conversations, but that's a massive gap, and there needs to be something rolled out for the whole community.
And Trish, did this come up in your workforce development report?
It did and it didn't. What the workforce talked about was some of the shortcomings of men's behaviour change programs, and one of the ways that they suggested to kind of fill that gap is through more intensive case management with men, which I think touches on what Steve's saying. It's about providing men with a safe space where they can really open up and build those therapeutic relationships to have these difficult conversations about what's happening in their lives and their relationships. The way that it did come out, though, in the workforce perspectives was when they talked about what's happening in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. There's some really great examples of programs that are working with men, and it's really that sense of being led by elders in the community, providing men with a place where they can connect with country, they can connect with their culture, and learn about the ways that I guess colonisation has impacted their lives and perhaps is impacting their relationships as well.
And these were currently in place, but fairly limited in availability, is the sense from the report.
It relies on what Laura was talking about, where community-led organisations have the impetus to do this, and it takes a few community champions to bring this kind of work together and create these programs. And the examples that I've written about in the report are based in the Northern Territory, and you can read about them, but I know of other examples as well.
Yeah. Thanks,
and I'm sure
Trish. And Kelsey?
Well, I think for it to work with family and friends, because actually there's this big, unless you've done 1 million hours of training for, you know, and are a men's behaviour change facilitator, do not speak to any men or people who use violence and abuse, because you know, and it's reasonable, you know, because people are worried, are you going to do it wrongly? Are you going to make the safety of partners a problem? You know, like I can see, but we have to do something because, you know, such a small percentage are going to that at the moment. So we need some sort of journey thing, and it starts with family and friends. But it might be a very simple part of motivational interviewing that says, how are things at home? You know, there's help available if there are things that are happening in your relationship that you'd like to change. I know some people who went along and it was great, or I heard about this service. But what we can't do is get them from there to a men's behaviour change. That's just too far. And obviously the men's referral service and men's line, but even those might be a bit too far. And there's some UK programs by Respect and Women's Aid, again, about early awareness raising, you know, like I think there is pathways and it needs resourcing, but I think we need to think through, you know, do men's line and men's referral service and those other helplines, you know, would we get them to them from family and friends or from general practice? You know, is that the pathway, or do we need something a little more like what Trish has just been talking about in between those that then might get them to it? And obviously we're doing the work where we're looking at an online healthy relationship tool called Better Man, where we're trying to bridge that gap of that sort of early intervention.
So that's an online tool that anybody can access, or a family or friend?
Yeah, we're trialling it at the moment, yes, in a formal randomised controlled trial. But the idea is that it's to encourage help seeking, the motivational, to you know, reflect on their behaviours. And I don't expect friends and family to have the skills to get them to do full motivation, and neither did Steve either. But this idea that you could do these simple things like, oh, things aren't working at home, you know, you can get help, you know, there's help.
So that sort of broader educative purpose, it has that twofold effect in a sense of, you know, cluing up the community in terms of not the statistics of prevalence, but our dynamics, but what help is available. Laura, is it something that you provide in your service, like in terms of an educative opportunity for people that present or accompany people that are coming to the service?
Not at present. The only, you know, the work we do with the Young Women's Program is with boys as well, where we do that early intervention, but it's at present outside of our scope to do that more intensive work.
So it's a real opportunity to fill a gap. So one of the third themes that came through in terms of the recommendation was the carrying the burden alone, which was a central theme across the research for victims and survivors, as you pointed out, Kelsey. And you talked about care navigators and recommended that they be identified or appointed to help women feel more supported during the help-seeking journey. What do you mean by this? What would it look like in practice?
Yeah, so care navigators have been around quite a bit in, you know, obviously in health, in aged care and mental health care and cancer care, you know, because they're complex areas to navigate as well. And they're basically experts at teaming up with people to find solutions, you know, and they can have a range of day jobs. You know, some of them, you know, could be nurses or receptionists or admin team members. You know, in the UK, they've got a range of jobs, and they're actively listening and signposting people to sources of help, advocacy and support, and that to help people play an active role in whatever's happening in their lives. Now, you know, examples are with severe mental illness, you know, and there they use peer specialists, you know, so people who've been through the system. And I think there's a great opportunity, you know, with peer navigators. And some of them have been trialled. Angela Taft led some trials of mentor mothers, and that's been taken up in various places. family court, we know we've got the court support network with people, you know, and we all know family courts are very difficult to navigate. So I'm not specifically saying that everybody have that expertise, but this idea that people who are not, you know, they might be played by all sorts of roles. But I think, you know, some people call them care coordinators as well. It's the idea that, you know, the way to wellbeing and safety is a difficult, a treacherous path, and maybe someone signposting for them would be helpful.
Lily and Laura, Lily, I'll go to you first. What do you think of this recommendation?
I really like this idea. In fact, many years ago, I actually had the opportunity to participate in a program that sounds very similar by description to this care navigator. I was basically buddied with a lady who was not a victim survivor herself, but who was given training in family violence, so she had an understanding, and just was someone who gave me her time, a listening ear, and provided a great deal of emotional support, and given the burden that family violence has on your extended family, it meant I could sometimes offload the distress without distressing my family onto someone who, I guess there was a bit of a safety net. They're not so emotionally involved because they're not a direct relative. So I found it incredibly helpful, and it's a service I would have loved to. I'd love to see it expanded and be available to more women. Yeah.
Great. And so you said there was a lot of emotional support provided. Was there also that navigation through the service system support with that? Or
there was a little bit of that as well. Yeah.
Laura, how does your service respond to? Do you have requests for care navigators or the like?
We don't get requests for that in specific, like in relation to DV. Obviously, like Kelsey talked about it, we do have women who access that for mental health, disability, those sorts of things. I think it's a wonderful idea. I think the power of, you know, speaking to someone who's been through something similar is really quite amazing in DV. But I do think it needs to be coupled with, you know, resourcing for intensive casework. Because you know, at the moment, we're resourced to provide low to medium casework, which sometimes it's not enough. And there's women, like I said at the start, that have timed out other services, or they don't meet the criteria, and there just isn't that service to navigate, you know, the crazy system. So I think would be amazing if we could have that two-pronged approach where you've got the care navigator doing the emotional support, some of the lower level system navigation, and then that really intensive higher level casework alongside.
Like a stepped care, which is what the other models are.
Yeah.
No, I think a really important recommendation that's come through from the report. And I mean, it draws on some of the health the models in the health system. And health services, interestingly enough, were the most accessed professional services by victims and survivors, and also people who use intimate partner violence and or sexual violence in the report. And health services may include, as you pointed out, Kelsey, mental health or drug and alcohol services, and are not a specific service aimed at behaviour change. So, Steve, what's the role of health services engaging people who use violence early?
Look, apart from family and friends being that first point of contact, you know, the Royal Australian College of GPs and National Department of Social Services over the recent years have been providing funding for training in identifying and responding. And we know that each state to some degree has seen an expansion of that training, but there's a long way to go. So when we think of the number of GPs, the number of psychologists, allied health, it's even more critical than ever that they're trained in the basics of identifying and responding. Ideally we need a nationally accredited training program, I believe, in male family violence that meets nationally standards, that looks at working with mum, the kids, dad, and responding to risk in a collaborative framework. So ideally each sector, health, legal, police and so on, all need to be on that same page about identification and responding. And I think, like any work, while we're absorbed in our own practice, and this is certainly any experience of being absorbed in our own practice, it can be really difficult to stop and see or hear or pick up the man that's using violence, because he works really hard at remaining invisible. So I think it's important for workers to have those skills to be able to hear, and also thinking about the responsibility level, because different workers are going to respond at different levels, but everyone needs to be on that same page about responses. And I think what needs to happen is agencies need to build capability and capacity, certainly at some level, but workers need to understand, well, what's their confidence and competence level, because you can have lots of confidence but not a lot of competence. So really, I think thinking about tiered roles in different levels, a bit like the Marham framework, that's what's needed nationally.
Mm-hmm. What's your response to that, Kelsey?
Absolutely. And so where family and friends might ask if 1 or 2 questions, I mean, GPs and psychologists and psychiatrists and other, they've learnt motivational interviewing for alcohol change and for, so actually the perpetrator's behaviour, it's a behaviour change, and they're, smoking, they have these models in their heads, most of the practitioners, and so you can get them to ask more questions. Have you done anything you've later regretted? Do you think your children and partners are afraid? And we're certainly teaching that as part of the readiness program, and the Commonwealth have funded us and PHNs to be doing this work. And we've got videos of people trying to do that. We've got an e-learning module, the White Book from the College of GP, who are our partners, certainly have a whole chapter on men who use violence and abuse. And we ran a community of practice last night on it. So, I mean, I think these are things that, again, people have been frightened of, but I think we should be leaping into it.
Yeah, and really posting them so that people know they're around, that they're trained, that they're out there, that they're Yeah. Laura, what's your sense of it as a health service?
Look, I think there's a big push towards health services being trauma informed, but that doesn't necessarily align and mean that services are also DV informed. I was very excited to see in the report that one of the recommendations was that the Safe and Together model become mandated, not only for those working in child protection, legal, police, those services, but also be extended to those working in health, including mental health and drug and alcohol. I started my career as a drug and alcohol counsellor for the first 5 years of my career, and I had no training on DV, zero. So I just think it is so important that, health practitioners are able to recognise that what might be presenting as one issue, like, a survivor presenting with a complex mental health issue, there's DV behind that, and there's ways in which the perpetrator's violence or abuse is intersecting with that mental health, whether it's directly caused it, whether it's exacerbated it, or whether she's, her access to treatment has been interfered as part of the coercive control. So I think it's really important that practitioners at the front line have the skills, the tools to be doing that assessment, so that a perpetrator's pattern of abuse, violence, like Steve said, doesn't become invisible. And just equally as important for, for men that are accessing these services as well. And I'll just say one last thing, I think the Safe and Together model provides a really excellent framework to understand those intersections between AOD, mental health, and perpetrators' violence and abuse, but also provides a really comprehensive framework for working with perpetrators to ensure accountability, respect, and give perpetrators the opportunity to understand the impact that their violence has on women and children, and to, create and foster change.
Yeah, definitely that whole pivoting to the perpetrator is a very important concept through the Safe and Together training, and which Kathy Humphries has written a great report on, invisible practices, so bringing that out. Trish, did it come up much in your report, in your research?
It did, particularly the Safe and Together model. That was a model that people highly regarded. and recommended as an effective and a promising intervention. And like Laura said, we made a recommendation about how that could be implemented across sectors. I think I can also speak from my own experience in terms of I'm a psychologist as well, and in my psychology training there was almost nothing on domestic family violence. And I've worked in programs that are specifically for families experiencing family violence, and the knowledge that I brought to that program came from my lived experience, but also from what I know from the research that I do. If I'd gone into that work just as a psychologist, there is so much that I would have missed. And yeah, it's such a huge shortcoming in the profession, and I'm sure psychology isn't the only mental health profession that has that issue.
Yeah, we know that psychiatrists get very little training, but what's even more surprising to me is actually it's not standard for social workers to get extended training in this, that it's actually an elective often. And so we're so used to thinking this is a social worker role and they're excellent at it, but in fact some of the new grads have had very little training in it. It's a very workforce issue. Anyway, very big workforce.
Yeah, huge, Kelsey, because I mean, you know, sort of moving deeper into the health workforce. So there's a recommendation for increased competency and capacity for general practice mental health and counselling services. Maybe we should include social workers there to deliver support to victims and survivors and people who use violence. How would you like to see this recommendation addressed, Kelsey?
Yeah, so I think you know, it is starting from the group who are told the most, and it's it is a group, general practice and psychologists and psychiatrists, private and public, who actually see the perpetrators. So, you know, there's a great opportunity to, and there's such a missed opportunity. And we know that training alone is not sufficient. So that's why one of the recommendations is about an item number for people to be using, because item numbers do help drive, and we've sort of trying to be advocating that for a while. But we do need a health system that is ready. Like you were talking about before, the authorising environment, the leadership. We need the clear referrals. We need the clear connections with services, that are healing, like Laura's. We need the clear connection also with them working together and feeding back again. And certainly the Commonwealth Government, as I said, has been funding primary health networks to do some of this work across the country, and it's expanding for GPs into sexual violence and child sexual abuse. But it's really a long way from resourcing. And the problem is when you resource one sector like this, people are worried, are you taking it away? Because obviously we need the crisis and we need the healing centres, and we need all of it. So how do we balance that across the full system? But I think it's been a very missed opportunity to not resource and work together to particularly with mental health services.
Yeah, given the complexity and the intersecting complexity with mental health, and which is really clearly disclosed in the report. I think one of the things that I really liked about the report was the case studies, and they clearly articulate that intersection of those complexities. You just mentioned healing services, and I wanted to ask you about yours, Laura. What's the centre's model of care? I understand it is developing a women's trauma recovery centre, and I'd just like to understand a bit more about that and how that works in this.
Yeah, absolutely. So the Trauma Recovery Centre, we're not up and running yet, but the model of care is around providing co-located wraparound services for survivors of FTV. So essentially a one-stop shop so that women can access support to heal from FTV holistically. So, crisis support, counsellors, caseworkers are all co-located with services such as Centrelink, DV-informed legal services, peer-led survivor groups, therapeutic group work programs, with soft entry points and referral pathways for children impacted by violence, and also for women with additional needs such as disability or acquired brain injuries, those sorts of issues. And I guess it's really about the centre being a safe place for women to access with soft entry points. It's free, it's accessible to all women across the lifespan, And, you know, there's no time limits on services, it's not criteria based, and self-referrals are welcome. So it's really about recognising the trauma from abuse, assisting women to heal, and providing timely, appropriate trauma and violence-informed responses to minimise the ongoing re-traumatisation that so many women experience when they're trying to navigate the system. So you know, really moving away from that siloed response and having that healing space all located in one spot.
And this is a pilot, and there's only one.
Yeah, so this will be a world first in the Illawarra. We've received the funding for operational costs for 5 years, and Trish will speak more, but there's ongoing advocacy for the land and the build from the New South Wales state government. But with the hope that, you know, we can get this up and running, and then it can be replicated throughout the country.
Great. We'll keep our eyes on that. And is there so there'll be an evaluation, and hopefully we'll have a look at how that's going.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you've mentioned peer survivor support, peer victim and survivor support. Lily, how might peer victim and survivor led support groups in each state be useful for healing and recovery, even if they're not in the same sort of model as Laura's just talked about?
Peer support groups are really validating spaces, places of support, comfort and understanding. You don't have to explain yourself. You know, other victim survivors just get it in a way that professionals often don't. And these days there's so many of these groups available online, and what's great about them is they're often linking women around the world. So if at 2 a.m. you can't sleep and something's distressing you, you can reach out and get support. So they are incredibly healing spaces, so important.
So there seems to be this spectrum of this continuity of support that is recommended, but that is also available, from support from family and friends through to allies, care navigators, peer support, and then more formal health supports and domestic and family violence sector supports. And I think it's about knowing where all of this is and knowing how to access it, and then building in the gaps, as you're saying, Kelsey. So I think the report really clearly puts this on the agenda. We've got a few questions, many questions coming in. I'm going to throw to you, Steve. Do you have any reflection on the dynamic in practice work on balancing holding people who use violence to account, but also being curious and empathetic? One quick reflection.
Very quickly, that is the practice work in any male family violence intervention work, whether it's the first contact that GPs might make, or whether it's the advanced specialist work, the men's behaviour change work, that it is complex art of being able to hold that balance between compassion and accountability, and that's part of the practice, and measuring and managing your own bias and your own internal reactions, managing your own flooding, being able to sit with really complex language and at times some really awful stories that men talk about how they've harmed their partners. So yeah, that's part of the pitch. And that takes some time to learn, but as Halsey said, it can be taught, and some specialists just quite easily translate what they already know into the practice. Yep.
And this is a question to the panel, but I might start with you, Kelsey. If we're wanting family and friends to have a greater understanding of all the aspects of domestic violence for victims, survivors, and perpetrators, is there any way of making domestic violence education compulsory in workplaces?
Yeah, so that would be the healthy relationship first aid, because that was part of that package. I think there's the universal messaging, you hope you're reaching a lot of people, and then the healthy relationship first aid could also, in workplaces, be that. And I really think that it's just you know, I thought you were going to say schools actually, because, you know, obviously there's respectful relationships in schools, and I think we're trying on different levels to be doing this, but because people are going to family and friends, we need to reach them in wherever they're at, including workplaces.
Did anybody else on the panel want to comment on that in terms of a workplace that they're in? We've talked a lot about the health workplaces, and Steve, you do a bit of workplace education, or?
We do limited workplace education, obviously, and thinking about what policy needs community to be far more involved, and the wider sector to be involved in engaging. And yeah, we're certainly measuring and been having some conversations with local PHNs around how we can expand that training. But that idea of it moving into wider into the community, into schools, into other parts is critical.
You know, government.
Exactly.
Yeah, awesome.
Yeah. And Kelsey, how hard was it to recruit perpetrators?
It was really hard.
How did you overcome the barriers?
Yeah, so this is a good example of accountability versus, you know, trying to engage, you know, because are you worried about your relationship? Have you got concerns, or are you concerned about your behaviour in your relationship? You know, like, how do we actually reach people? And but at the same time, we want to be making sure that people have actually, you know, done some of these behaviours. We are surprised that men are perfectly happy to answer the surveys, you know, 500 of them did. But when we got to the interview stage, that was when we had quite a number of trouble, and we had to talk to the advisory group quite a bit about how to, engage them. So, as I said, we only managed to engage 8 people. That was a bit of a time frame problem as well. But yeah, I think it is a challenge because of that. You know, you want to be softer to get them in, and then, you know, a little bit harder when you're actually talking about them. I mean, victim survivors are much easier. They want to, you know, contribute to help others, and, you know, it's very easy to recruit victim survivors through online advertising and other things.
And in their help-seeking journeys, they've told that story, haven't they?
Yeah.
They've been, yeah. Did the research on victims and survivors and people who use violence have a breakdown in age? And if so, were there differences in how age groups sought support? I think there were some high-level findings here, weren't there?
So it was more common that the age group between 18 and 40 participated. I should have said that. And we didn't get quite as many older people as we would have wanted. But I think that we haven't actually, I'm trying to remember, and I wish Elizabeth McClendon was here with me, but I don't think there were huge differences in help seeking by age. No, there wasn't. Yeah. I'll check that while you talk to someone else, because I have the report here.
Right there. And the report is available on the ANROWS website and in the chat. One of the question has just come through around the importance of this, the recommendations for policy and policymakers. A key takeaway in terms of the recommendation is the resourcing implications. What for implementing the raft of changes identified? Steve, from your perspective, what would you like to see implemented?
In the first instance, I think what's really critical is that national training be delivered. I know it sounds a bit of a bias coming from my own portfolio, but the struggle that we have is that the workforce doesn't have the capacity to meet the needs in responding to domestic and family violence. So this idea of moving broader into the community, moving up into policy, so that there's a real ownership from those who make the decisions at the higher end. This is what's critical, and I think probably what does help, and I really appreciate what Kelsey said there, that while training is important, what we need to do is we need to mentor people into the specialist of this part of the work. and that it needs to be a really sound pathway. The Education Centre Against Violence, next year, fingers crossed, we'll have 6 tiers of pathways in working with perpetrators. So when we think about those each individual steps, there's so many that need to be done. So at a policy level, I think government really needs to support training at so many different levels and so many different pathways. That's my takeaway from the particular report. Yeah.
And to answer, younger people went to family and friends more and less to formal services, which makes sense. So that makes them for earlier intervention, family and friends even more important.
Younger people, very important. And we've only got a minute to wrap up. Laura, your key policy takeaway, what would you like to see implemented?
I agree with Steve around the training, absolutely integral in terms of creating DV-informed workplaces in the front line, but the resourcing, like we are just strapped for resources. We are, you know, workers are just going above and beyond. We need more resourcing at all levels of service delivery. And, you know, sometimes we have women coming, but we just can't, we're so stuck in what we could do with them because there's no housing, you know, there's so many barriers for women and children. So the resourcing is just absolutely key for me.
Lily, what would you like to see done?
To be honest, I totally agree with everyone here, but I think perpetrators need to be held front and centre. If there are no perpetrators, there's no victims, and we're not going to need all these services and resources. So I think perpetrators, keeping them front and centre at every level in everything we do.
Thanks, Lily. Trish, what's your key?
I mean, I echo what everyone has said, but particularly what Laura said about resourcing. I think for me, I'm obviously a big proponent of healing and recovery approaches, but the standout thing from the report that I worked on was children and young people. And from, like Kelsey just said, an early intervention perspective, this is where we need to be putting our attention. I think in your report, Kelsey, 50% of people who use violence had experienced child abuse themselves. We really need to have early intervention services for children and young people that are therapeutic and that recognise that they're not only people who use violence, but they're also victims and survivors themselves.
There's such an increasing evidence base for that, Trish. Thank you. And Kelsey, finally to you to wrap up in terms of
well, it's pretty easy because I've got a passion involving survivors in the solutions as co-designers, co-researchers, and resource the peer workforce. To me, it's a no-brainer. It's just going to make, well, it's going to tell us to concentrate on perpetrators. You know, all sorts of solutions will come out from lived experience.
Yeah. Look, I'd like to say a really big thank you. We have worked a bit over time, but thank you to this panel. Thank you to the lead researchers, Trish and Kelsey. The reports are fabulous, as are the resources within them. And the case studies. And as I said earlier, we will be doing some work at ANROWS and with the researchers on developing those further, and also having different forums for breaking down some of the data and having conversations around the recommendations. Really big thank you to you, Lily. Thank you for your personal experience that you've shared with us today and your professional experience in terms of the health sector and its response to the recommendations of the report. And Laura, thank you so much. We're going to keep watching the centre, the Healing and Recovery Centre, as a beacon for trauma-informed recovery and healing. And a big shout out and thanks to you, Steve. ICAB does a great job, and I think together the panel has really answered and unpacked the findings of the report. So thank you all again. The webinar recording will be available on the ANROWS website. And as you exit, I hope you'll give us some feedback. And for any researchers tuning in today, if you're working on projects addressing violence against women, you can register on the ANROWS Register of Active Research, which collects new and emerging projects. But finally, I'd like to acknowledge and say thank you to all of the lived expertise that we have on watching today, and acknowledge your experiences and your expertise in, and as Kelsey said, informing us of the way forward and the responses to intimate partner and sexual violence. So thanks everybody. Michelle Robinson, and I'd like to say bye for now.